I'm doing a doctoral degree right now in modern thought and literature, and my area of focus is spatial history and spatial theory. I think that will be probably obvious once I begin reading this paper. So I'm going to read, this is a reading. And I'm talking about space and haunting. This paper was something I wrote around Halloween last year, so picture that, I guess. And one other bit of information, it's an excerpt from a much longer paper, and so you might feel that there's more information or more questions that you would have, and we can talk about those. But this paper is going to be published in a book about ghosts and psychoanalysis, so that's what it's context. Ghosts are unstable and elusive figures, lacking mass, biology, or finitude in the normal senses of these words. Yet they may equally be sensed through their lingering absence, as we might say, figures in the negative. Indeed, this ambiguity in relation to presence and absence is a defining characteristic of ghosts. Wanting in substance, they paradoxically give body to grief, plotting themselves into its interstices precisely so that the living may lament the unknowable status to which their dead have been relegated. We encounter the dead somewhere between the material locations marked for them by association and the hollowed out vacancies in which they, once animate, are now missing. While in many ghost stories the ghost haunts specific people, holding them accountable for their injustices and faults, in this talk I will think instead about how ghosts might collectivize to haunt the spatial and psychical hollows of popular culture. More broadly, the Winchester Mystery House, trademark registered, is a perfect example of this kind of collectivizing of haunting. Has anybody been to this place? It's just outside of San Jose. Excellent. I love this place. It's a historic residence of approximately 160 rooms, located on the outskirts of San Jose, California. And whether you visit this place in person and spend upwards of $33 for the privilege, or watch one of the many documentaries about it, you're likely to get the same explanation for its mystery. The mansion, with its elaborately enfolded interiors, is reputed to be the haunted result of a grieving woman's madness. And just to give you a tiny short version of this myth that the tour guides will tell you at this mansion, Sarah Winchester was the heiress to the Winchester rifle fortune. And as a widow, after her husband died, she supposedly went to see a spiritualist on the East Coast where she lived. She was in Connecticut. And that spiritualist told her, supposedly, to move west and begin construction and keep the construction going in perpetuity. And so the myth is that she moved to this farmhouse that was already there, a small place, and started adding to it and never stopped. So there's one other bit to it, which is that somewhere in the middle of this house there's a small room that they claim was a seance room, in which at the stroke of midnight each night she would go and listen to get to the spirits of the people who were killed at the other ends of Winchester rifles for instructions on the next day's designs. The ghost story behind the Winchester House belies specific historical fears and wishes which coincided with Sarah Winchester's adult life, particular anxiety circulating throughout the United States from its ever-burgeoning culture of guns and gun violence. And this was, she moved there in the 1880s, and then she died in 1922, I think. The ghost story speaks, if not directly, then associatively, of the role of gun technologies in the Civil War, which in turn was closely linked to the East, in the East, to the pernicious effects of slavery. And it speaks of guns' roles in the near annihilation of Native American populations, most notably in the West. It also reflects an unprecedented rise in spiritualism, a widespread phenomenon in which bereaved and displaced masses who lost loved ones in wars, including the Civil War, were desperate to make contact with their dead. And I think that was especially true after World War I as well. So now I'm just going to have a little digression on space and ideas about space, since this is about space and content. Most people, if they think about space at all, simply take it for granted. Space is what separates here from there, that expansive vista or at the limit outer space of the atmosphere. But what if what we call space were really only air, land, or at some other level, a geometric measure or distance? What if, in other words, there were no such thing as physical space, but only concrete and material things like soil, carbon, and oxygen on the one hand, and abstract concepts like distance, measure, or medium on the other? Traditionally, the word space has encompassed all of these meanings and more. It's important, therefore, to scrutinize the extent to which ideas about space may be connected with modes of thinking and imagining, which in turn might be reified in the environment. In its most basic and historical sense, the word space has frequently been used to designate, as I said, distance, a discontinuity which at the same time is premised on a presumption of continuity. I hope you recognize this from your high school math classes. This is what we call Cartesian space, which is, in this case, for a three-dimensional spatial system, you have three axial planes with sort of consistent or uniform metric distances between points that can be annotated or denotated graphically. This is x, y, z for the three planes of three-dimensional space. Space serves as a fundamental condition or tool of thought, both the holding capacity and the ultimate limit of emptiness, or no thing. Architecture, which ostensibly concerns itself with space and spatial praxis, moves both toward and away from the delineation of emptiness. When we construct architectural space, we delimit metric dimensions of earth, air, light, and building materials out of a polysemous contiguity. To some extent, we do this intentionally. We want protection from the elements and from undesired contact with other people. But the barriers that buildings impose can only provide for protection at the expense of the contiguous real. Buildings do separate and contain us. They do keep others away. They do hold weather, sounds, and moonlight at bay. At the same time, however, the elements, qualities, and experiences we exclude are left to haunt our rooms, stairs, and cabinets, just as the residua of potential meanings haunt our efforts at precise locution. A further complication of space in the everyday sense in which we use this word is the extent to which our bodies are in and of it reflexively. We internalize the standards of everyday architectural space to such a degree that we rarely reflect on what its walls, windows, and roofs keep from us. Through lifetimes of repeated movement, we incorporate the spatial conventions of environmental design down to their smallest and most detailed nuances. The feel in one's legs and feet of a stairway's standard proportion of rise to run, the sense of inside as distinct from out, a window's relationship with light, air, and view, the meaning and utility of a door, a floor, ceiling, or wall, the placement of a handle on a cabinet, the roominess of a room, and so on. We're so habituated to each of these and myriad other more or less standardized features of environmental design that in the course of using and moving through the built environment, any apperception of physical details remains largely unconscious. Indeed, standardized units and configurations of space are fundamentally integral to our corporeal schemata, which is what I call how our bodies know how to move around in the environment. We depend on them in our daily navigations of the human world. And just as conventions exist in the details of buildings, so also do they exist in the larger sense of room design, as well as in the broader arrangement of rooms within floor levels or vertical layering of a building's floor plans. In residential structures where interiors support the most intimate and even primitive of uses, and here I think of dwelling, which is a noun, in its original sense, which was the active verbal form, the verb form, to dwell. These standards of arrangement and use are all the more charged with social mores in residential design. Indeed, it is difficult to ignore the extent to which dwellings have been organized historically to both enforce and reproduce primarily patriarchal and heteronormative values and traditions. And this is particularly true in the period in which Sarah Winchester was building her house in the Victorian era. Architectural theorist Mark Wigley traces these patterns in residential design to an historic wish to sequester women and female sexuality. He aligns this impetus with long-standing fantasies about architectural meaning, the architectural meaning of sexual difference. And this is a quote from Mark Wigley. The woman's body is seen as an inadequate enclosure because its boundaries are convoluted. While it is made of the same material as a man's body, it has been turned inside out. Her house has been disordered, leaving its walls full of openings. Consequently, she must always occupy a second house, a building, to protect her soul. That's the end of the quote. According to historian Gwendolyn Wright, Victorian residential architecture deliberately sustained this legacy of feminine containment, translating and sublimating it within emerging ideas about privacy, class, and interiority, as well as in, above all, ideas about the family. Each of these values is reflected in the floor plans and stylistic tropes of Victorian dwellings. The sitting room, boudoir, and fainting room as examples were viewed as deeply feminine spaces whose names betrayed their essentially static uses. Victorian verbs associated with pregnancy and female illness, lying in, for instance, during one's confinement, further underscored the extent to which women were obliged to remain indoors and inactive. That's Sarah Winchester. It's the only known photograph of her. Imagine then how people of her class and social context would have been confounded by the place that she called Granada Villa, which is what we know of as the Winchester Mystery House. This is the place where she lavished by far the majority of her design attentions. Most of the iconic images of the Winchester House consist in exterior photographs showing a Victorian mishmash. Jumbled and irregular turrets, balconies, dormers, and porticos, all stemming from an ever-expanding interior scape, which changed frequently over the course of 2 decades. And just incidentally, contrary to what they say on the tours, it wasn't in construction in perpetuity, and they didn't work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In fact, they worked pretty regular hours, and all of the construction ended with the earthquake in 1906. To put this in it's difficult from these images to infer any particular hierarchy or organizational theme in the building's composition. To put this another way, if we imagine the Winchester House as a text, we must plainly confess our ignorance of its syntax. Yet to admit this ignorance is to confront directly our default expectations of hierarchy and organization in buildings of any type. One might imagine that the interior spaces of the Winchester House offer a more reliable index of the building's architectural logic. In actuality, however, one's initial sense of the inside proves even less intuitive than its tumbling exteriors. Yes, the rooms and halls are constructed in the conventional ways of their time and locale, using, for the most part, standard wood framing. Yes, the finishes, wood paneling, woven and embossed wall coverings, parquet floors, and stained glass windows are also, by and large, common to the late Victorian era, particularly for an upscale home like this. Nevertheless, something is decidedly queer inside this Winchester House, and it's not necessarily the bizarre features pointed out by the tour guide. Architecturally speaking, the design of the Winchester House is distinctive in at least 2 significant ways. On the one hand, in its continuous flow of space between rooms and halls, and on the other, because of the way that light reaches all spaces in this place. And it takes up, I think, 6 or 7 acres of space, and you saw it was in that first image, it's 160 plus rooms. It was at one time much larger. And it's at times 3 or 4 stories high. So imagine how difficult it is to get daylight into all parts of that house. But she did. We don't don't know, historically speaking, why Sarah Winchester chose to extend the contours of the small farmhouse she purchased in 1886. We do know, thanks to her biographer, Mary Jo Ignaco, that besides enjoying her involvement in the construction of her in-laws' substantial residence in New Haven, Connecticut prior to moving to California, she also extensively subscribed to and read architectural journals, and in personal correspondence expressed ongoing interest in the design and furnishing of her home. The house itself and its detail demonstrates Sarah Winchester's ingenuity in solving certain kinds of architectural problems, structural ones as well as more imaginative ones, like how to use the building's roofs and gutters to capture and conserve stormwater for later use in her green spaces and gardens, how to let her servants know where to find her in the house, how to mediate between semi-public and deeply private uses, and so on. Sarah Winchester's problem-solving intelligence extends to the overall logic of the house, which admittedly goes against the grain of conventional residential design. Above all, an implicit sense of movement in the arrangement of its spaces confounds our habitual expectations for stillness in domestic interiors. The house reflects a spatiality, not a space, that fosters a different standard for what building does or can do. In the Winchester House, space is an effect of the fluid interplay between bodies and construction elements, not a resource to be commandeered. It takes you in, but it does not keep or contain you. It lets you go. Indeed, it actively ushers you through. The fixed positions recorded in photographs, iconic or otherwise, can't convey this effect, nor can the purely visual and auditory movement recorded in videos made by tourists and documentarians. Only embodied movement as such permits a full registration of the mystery embedded in Sarah Winchester's design. Dwelling in this residence does not mean staying still, nor can it mean sitting or lying down in the kinds of ladylike reposes usually associated with Victorian withdrawing and fainting rooms. Instead, dwelling is a verb suggesting continuous and reflective passage, this space connecting with another and another, each one staking, claiming, and then vacating its roomness to foster tentative correspondences in sense impressions, light and shadow, narrowing and widening, enclosure and expansion. In contradistinction to traditional homes of its time, the Winchester House is arguably also organized around light and air. Daylight draws you in and leads you through its rooms. During waking hours, there is no need of electrical lighting or mechanical ventilation anywhere in the house. Windows and skylights practically pull and bend the light to meet the needs of the building's recesses. The unlikely presence of daylight throughout the depths and layers of its rooms defies conventional architectural distinctions between inside and outside, object and space. In these and other ways, the Winchester House forces an awareness of two of the most basic conceits of architecture. On the one hand, its presumption of a uniform, static, and homogeneous field of representational space, which is what I call Cartesian space, the mathematical XYZ planes. And on the other, its instrumentation of spatial experience, and by extension, its active role in the reproduction of normative embodiment. When architectural space deviates from convention, as it does in the Winchester House, we suddenly perceive the profound and vacuous emptiness of space itself, as the conceptual absence against which substance is always posited. The Winchester House keeps asking questions about the presumptions of this kind of a priori space, licensing a renewed or previously ill-perceived attention to what is usually excluded and delineated by walls, floors, and ceilings. In so doing, it necessarily poses questions about the particular body or bodily experience of its traversers as well. Are these sensations mine? Do I know them? Might they reflect something alien or unknown even as I feel them? Or does having them continually remake me by confronting me with a suddenly perceptible elusiveness in what I normally take for granted in the environment, thereby surprising my senses with reminders of what isn't there and filling me with a fleeting, tangible sense of loss? Ghosts are the ambiguously insubstantial beings to whom we attribute our own unaccountable sensations. When we encounter them, we find ourselves by definition in a liminal space, a gap, whose apperception involves aspects of our immediate surroundings, so queer in the Winchester House, as well as an anemic dimension of sensory residue, the byproduct of our long and cumulative conditioning within the built environment. Here, then, is one answer to the question of how haunting is possible. In the Winchester House, ghosts arise through Sarah Winchester's unique and unorthodox spatial aesthetic, which throws our expectations about space and dwelling into question. Thank you.